Hello, everyone. So, thank you for following along here with the Rome Where Are We course. This is our final installment. And of course, if you've been watching this and would like to be part of the next continuation of the course, of the next session of our discussions where we'll be able to go even more in depth, please feel free to make a comment. You can click on the contact info on this video and let us know. We'd love to hear about your interests. So, for this last session, we're taking a look back at everything, analyzing the narrative, and to help us along with that is an extract from a chapter of Decline of the West, Volume 2, about the soul of the city. This is the end of that chapter, the fifth section of it. And in it, Spengler talks about what happens to civilizations, what happens to all civilizations when they reach a certain age of final maturity. So I think that it's remarkable because this is really, in general, in the largest sense of the analysis, this is where we are, this is where Rome was, and we can see the general outlines of what's happening. The sense of, as John has brought up in the past, of polyphobia, fear of the city, the sense of the cities collapsing, the cities being completely driven by intellect and less by nature, less by instinct, and about what that does to a culture, to an economy, to families, even. And so he says, starting here on what is page 1 of the reading, but is page 99 of Volume 2, the stone colossus Cosmopolis stands at the end of the life's course of every great culture. The culture man whom the land has spiritually formed is seized and possessed by his own creation. He says a bit further down, the cities are now wholly intellect. And you can see how that happened. This was so prescient of him to observe. He's publishing this in 1919, and conceptual art bursts onto the scene with Marcel Duchamp not long after this. And this is art that has become fully intellectualized. The idea that even beauty is not important. Representation is not important. What's important is the idea that is communicating, is that abstract art becomes a type of language, and that it can just simply say something with clarity, or perhaps something clever is the point, and that it operates purely in this intellectual mode. Even to the point where it will become unpleasant, transgressive, or as they say, challenging, in order to heighten that sense, to not distract someone with the beauty instinct. Perhaps it sharpens that contrast, and it shows that one is sophisticated. It shows that one is this purely urban, modern, city-dwelling person that is of this time. I thought this was remarkable. He says that the houses in which people live are no longer houses in which Vesta and Janus, Lares and Penates have any sort of footing, but mere premises. Again, the ideas. Peter Eisenman would be big on this in the 70s and the 80s. Premises which have been fashioned not by blood but by requirements, anticipating functional architecture. Not by feeling, but by the spirit of commercial enterprise. Think of something like Mies van der Rohe's buildings and the office buildings, that it's purely straight up and down black and glass. So long as the hearth has a pious meaning as the actual and genuine center of a family, the old relation to the land is not wholly extinct. Remarkable in architecture, once again, to think of Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright was fond of saying that the hearth is the heart of the home. And there's a very, very interesting moment, that you could see that the technology is what is liquidating these old values, like it often does. That Frank Lloyd Wright in the Usonian houses that came after World War II, there's a television in it which is kind of, it almost looks like where you would place a microwave oven. It's very close to the kitchen. It's kind of up in the wall, and he has the television. He worked the television into the plan, but he shoves it way off to the side, and it's not the center and the focal point. It doesn't replace the fire. And he has a fireplace, which with everything around it the way that he would think. And the advent of television was, again, this abstracting, this intellectualizing, this delocalization. If you had books, the media of a book or a newspaper, as many of us experience and enjoy today, you can go to any British pub and sit by a fireplace with a book or a newspaper. Text fits into the old traditions very well, but television draws all of the senses, not all of them, but most of our senses and our full attention into this network sphere, and even more so with these little devices that we keep in our pockets. And that way you're not, you can be a couch potato when you're walking down the street, so to speak, and can be absorbed in this other world, intellectualized out of your sensory environment and into a virtual environment everywhere that you are. And so hence, and there you can see even the dawn of the people who would prefer to ride a train to work, which I've enjoyed doing, but that comes up in the context of a situation where people there are people who resist that, the people who really want to say, to drive somewhere, that comes kind of from an instinct of driving your cart out into the fields. And it's part of that old stubborn practice of being bodily involved in what you're doing and where you're going, versus preferring to just kind of gently detach from the environment and become intellectually involved in something, which the mass transportation allows you to do. And you have that's one way of understanding that kind of split in societal preferences. These things tend to intensify as the civilization tends to the completion, as he says, of its culture form. He says here, the old mature cities with their Gothic nucleus of cathedral town halls and high-gabled streets, and they're ringed about by the Baroque growth of brighter and more elegant patricians' houses, begins to overflow in all directions in formless masses, to eat into the decaying countryside with their multiplied barrack tenements and utility buildings, to destroy the noble aspect of the old time by the clearances and rebuildings. So he's talking about urban sprawl. He's talking about, anywhere, edge city, suburbs. Remarkable to be able to publish this in 1919 out of Germany and to see that this was happening. He talks about how he calls it the chessboard plan, or the checkerboard plan, chessboard form, which is what the chessboard form is, what he refers to as street grids. And he points out, and I think this is very fascinating, it's very true, that you can see street grids show up at various civilizations throughout various periods of time. And he says that this is a hallmark of when rationalization and intellectualizing takes precedent over other things. It takes precedent over the curve of the landscape. And this is remarkable. On page 101, which is PDF page 3, I see long after AD 2000 cities laid out for 10 to 20 million inhabitants spread over enormous areas of countryside, with buildings that will dwarf the biggest of today's, and notions of traffic and communication that we should regard as fantastic to the point of madness. Well, here I am in the year 2023 reading that in Los Angeles County. He was absolutely correct about this. He wasn't alone in foreseeing this. Corbusier also imagined such things, and it was very popular. People could tell, if you were paying attention to the way that urbanity was evolving in the late 19th and early 20th century, you could see that this tendency was there, and the debate was really what to do about it and where to take it. Do you fight it? Do you embrace it? So on and so forth. He remarks that there is a different character to it, that in one distinction of the classical and the Roman era is how dense it was. that everyone wanted to live in the middle of the city, in its densest nucleus, for otherwise he could not feel himself to be the urban man that he was. In the year 74, Rome, in spite of its immense population, had the ridiculously small perimeter of 19.5 kilometers. That's 12 miles. So, very high density in the classical world, and we're a bit different. He says that there's a new type of raw man. The birth of the city entails its death. And I thought this was very interesting, that the homesickness for the great city, the homesickness for the metropolis, is keener than any other nostalgia. Home is for him any one of these giant cities, but even the nearest village is an alien territory. This is something that's important to think about with a split between blue and red America, that someone who has become accustomed to living in Seattle, New York, Chicago, would feel much more at home in any one of those intellectualized cities, those intellectualized spaces, than they would even going out to one of the outer suburbs of any one of those cities, which come across as disturbingly alien to them. You get an encounter of the mind with a foreign feeling of the bodily. And that leads to a kind of cultural splitting. That's very important to consider. He speaks of how tension is the characterization of this over-intellectualization, and so the dissipation of the tension, the sense of entertainment, consumption, becomes the main characteristic of cultural life in these cities. But he says that genuine play, joie de vivre, pleasure, inebriation are the products of the cosmic beat, and as such no longer comprehensible in their essence, but the relief of hard, intensive brain work by its opposite, conscious and practiced fooling, of intellectual tension by the bodily tension of sport, of bodily tension by the sensual straining after pleasure. He's talking about the hedonism of the city, of the spiritual straining after the excitements of betting and competition, the pure logic of the day's work by a consciously enjoyed mysticism. All this is common to the world cities of all the civilizations: cinema, expressionism, theosophy, boxing contests. One can find it all in Rome. Indeed, the connoisseur might extend his researches to the Indian, Chinese, and Arabian world cities as well, that all of these things are common to city life. And this is very important. This is a Nietzschean point at the bottom of page 5, which is page 103, PDF page 5. The last man of the world city no longer wants to live. Freud would later explore this in the Eros versus Thanatos sense, and that the will to go on, to have chaos within oneself, to give birth to a dancing star, that kind of push and drive is no longer there. And where it does exist in the city, it comes out as a kind of romanticism. We're living through that. He touches on romanticism. But before this, he talks about children. Children do not happen, not because children have become impossible, but principally because intelligence at the peak of intensity can no longer find any reason for their existence. And isn't that interesting? If you're living in a world driven by pure intellect, it's very seldom that you're going to find a rational existence to have babies. But the thing is, babies don't need rational anything to exist and to come into being. Babies come because of instinct. That's why babies have always been caused by instinct. But when you have instinct being overridden by the intellect, there are simply less children. And when this starts to happen, then the urban metropolis can no longer sustain itself. This is when the hollowing out begins. That's a very, very important shift. He says, when the ordinary thought of a highly cultivated people begins to regard having children as a question of pros and cons, the great turning point has come. This was already happening in the 1890s to a certain extent, and it has only intensified since then. He touches on this. And he basically has several paragraphs which are like an essay on feminism. It's a very, very prescient discussion here. He says the Ibsen, this is very remarkable. He says, as in Babylon, in Rome, as in our cities, a man's choice of the woman who is to be not mother of his children as amongst peasants and primitives, but his own companion for life. That becomes a problem of mentalities. Well, isn't that the plot to every romantic comedy, the subject of every advice column, the objective of every online dating application? This is what we've been dealing with. I think people have not even realized that this kind of shift has happened. That instead of someone that you have children with as the main thing, there's the companion for life. And of course, it makes things way more complicated. He calls this the Ibsen marriage, after the plays of Heinrich Ibsen. There's the higher spiritual infinities in which both parties are, quote, free. That is, intelligence is free from the plant-like urge of the blood to continue itself, and it becomes possible for George Bernard Shaw to say that unless a woman repudiates her womanliness, her duty to her husband, to her children, to society, to the law, and to everyone but herself, she cannot emancipate herself. So this is really remarkable. A lot of people, there's a lot of Kulturkritik happening now, which tends to pin this on communism. And certainly, among communists, they tend to pick that up. Shaw himself was a socialist. They see this as a tearing down of tradition to promote revolution and to see the uprooting of society. Spengler, however, takes a step back. I think maybe to Spengler, communism would be a kind of mechanized Calvinism. That communism is an intellectualization of every aspect of life, a rationality applied to the economy. Scientific socialism, as Marx himself put it, it is an extension of the intellect. It is simply a function of this city being. So the primary woman, the peasant woman, he says, is a mother. That in traditional societies, a woman is a mother. And that makes sense, that being a mother, especially if you have lots of children, it's an incredibly consuming full-time job. And when you're growing a population, you're having lots of children, so women are mothers. It's the defining thing of their lives. Yet, then when you have the intellectual society take over, and a woman, because of the surplus produced by the economy, women are then given this choice to do things other than being a mom. This is a huge shift in society, and it creates this weird little space where the civilization, has a surplus which is beginning to be drained. Eric Weinstein put this very, very well. He talked about how we have gone from a productive economy to an extractive economy, and that the science programs, the universities, everything, the sense of competition has become so cutthroat because these cultural institutions are about the extraction of wealth instead of the production of wealth. Or in the sense of finance, it's about the management of wealth. It's not really the creation of something new. It's about how do you put the coin through the Plinko system to get the most benefit for you and your clients and everybody. It's management of the process, not necessarily the creation of something new. So, and in less and less and more focused areas do you have production. Think about our technological innovation. You've gone from the big thing being cars to a smaller device. It was computers are the new thing, and then the smaller device, it's the phones, and then it's the watches. These new breakthrough things are getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. We're producing less and less and extracting more and more. So, and eventually there comes a hollowing out time. He says at this level, and then eventually he says when a woman is, there's the peasant woman who's a mother, and after that the Ibsen woman, the comrade. He's making a nod to socialism. The comrade, the heroine of a whole megalopolitan literature, Instead of children, she has soul conflicts. Well, there you are. So, marriage is a craft art for the achievement of mutual understanding. It's amazing how apt he is here. It's the same whether the case against children is the American lady's argument who would not miss a season for anything, or the Parisienne's who fears that her lover would leave her, or an Ibsen heroine who belongs to herself. They all belong to themselves, and they are all unfruitful. Meaning they're not having children. And so he's, again, he doesn't dwell on this here, but he's following up on the narcissism that happens. And we can see that in this megalopolitan phase, you have women focusing on themselves. And there's a risk of narcissism there. And guess what? When the women are focusing on themselves and they want to be indulged, then narcissism for the goose is narcissism for the gander, and you get an increase in men who are narcissistic and think, oh, if the women are just focusing on themselves and I can just get what I want from the woman, and then you have these two kind of jerks who seem like they deserve each other, and this is what everyone, at least professes they don't want to have in a relationship, yet it happens. All of this is a symptom of the civilization getting old. So I suppose that all of these, the hippies had their left-wing thing that said get back to the land. These days you have a right-wing prepper thing that is saying get back to the land. This always happens naturally, one way or another. Because once there is nothing left to extract and the population collapse happens, people are back to the land anyway, simply to survive. We're not there yet, but we're getting there. Yes, appalling depopulation. That's exactly where he's going. At this level, all civilizations enter upon a stage which lasts for centuries of depopulation. He says the depopulation can last a very long time. It's not always a collapse. In fact, he says it's very seldom a collapse. He said that the Rome and the Mayans are two examples of a civilization that didn't move along for a long time. And that both of them are remarkable because of that. So, I thought this was amazing. 107, PDF page 109. Consequently, we find that everywhere in these civilizations that the provincial cities are at an early stage, the giant cities, in turn at the end of the evolution, stand empty, harboring in their stone masses a small population of fellahin, who shelter in them as the men of the Stone Age sheltered in caves and pile dwellings. He talks about Indian cities that were abandoned. Asoka's capital in India was abandoned. Chinese travelers going through India remarking this, and talking about the great Maya cities that must have been abandoned even in Cortez's time. And this is remarkable. A guy in 1919 was the Mayan. This was very pioneering archaeology and history that he was aware of. The classical Mayan civilization was barely entering on to historical consciousness. It was something that local villagers knew. Oh yeah, that's the old city over there. But people around the globe weren't even aware of and weren't studying it. It was when you could fly over them in airplanes and get to them and see them that it became popular, and that was in the 1920s. So he has an awareness of this, which is really, really remarkable. Yeah, in the series of classical writers from Polybius onward, he says, we read of old, renowned cities in which the streets have become lines of empty, crumbling shells, where cattle browse in forum and gymnasium, and the amphitheater is a sown field, dotting with emergent statues and herms. There's a very poetic bit in Fight Club. Fight Club is very much kind of an action movie distillation of these themes. It even treats to the dialogue, the problematic dialogue between a narcissistic man and a narcissistic woman. And it kind of, I guess, the white pill version of Fight Club is you can say that at the end of this, through all this kind of destruction, they've kind of figured out how to, be good for each other, hopefully. It's ambiguous, but there's a very poetic moment in that where the Brad Pitt character is saying, sleep now, go to sleep, and when you wake up, the world will be different. Women will be pounding corn on the abandoned overpasses of the highways, and the skyscrapers will be abandoned. And this is the type of thing that that's a literature. Fight Club falls in a literature tradition of describing the abandonment of cities, describing the agriculturalization of cities. That Chuck Palahniuk is standing in a long line that goes back to Polybius and other authors. He says here, if the early period is characterized by the birth of the city out of the country, and the late by the battle between city and country, the period of civilization is that of the victory of city over country. The city is not now living in direction, but extension. This is something important in German. The difference between an accusative and a dative. Yes, an accusative and a dative preposition. If you have action in your verb, if you're using what they call the two-way prepositions. So if you have the action, the zu, I'm not going to get into the German, but talking about direction versus extension, that's like it's a German grammatical distinction that has to do with destination versus location. So it's changing the way that you think about something. That in the Kultur phase, you're thinking about direction. There's an action, there's a destination. But in the Zivilisation phase, it's not about action and traveling, it's about growth. Instead of an accusative verb, it becomes a dative verb. So it follows from this that whereas every form language of a culture, together with the history of its evolution, adheres to the original spot, civilized forms are at home anywhere, and capable therefore of unlimited extension as soon as they appear. They're not really going anywhere. It's the flaneur who could be at home in any city and just wanders and has his absorbed in awareness that just floats with them, and it doesn't matter where they are particularly. As opposed to the peasant, where it absolutely does matter where you are. He talks about romanticism. Yes, here we are. I talked about the flaneur. He's talking about romanticism. It's the literature of the world city. Again, this is a very German distinction. He talks about that which is disseminated is no longer a style, but a fashion. This is the big distinction between, probably, I don't have the German here with me, but it's probably the big distinction that was very big in modernist architecture. They talked about Stil anstatt Mode. Style versus fashion. And so there's no longer a rooted style, which has to do with a tradition, with a living tradition, but there's a fashion, which is abstracted, which is self-referential, a little bit more narcissistic. And he calls these moonlight civilizations. And he says the best example of these are China and Japan. He says especially Japan, where these are civilizations where a very old civilization has lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years in its final form. So it doesn't mean the end of the world when we come to the civilization phase. We can look at China and Japan, and we can expect, if we're lucky, we're going to go through that kind of transformation, and perhaps that might be part of the dynamics of the reasons of why China is becoming so influential over the United States. It has to do with money, but it might also have to do morphologically with the Chinese having a perhaps instinctual understanding of where the United States is going with this, because the Chinese culture went through the transformation that the United States is going through, but they went through it hundreds of years ago. Saying that the classical is our one example of a civilization broken off in the moment of its full splendor. So the Germans only destroyed the upper layer of the forms and replaced it by the life of their own pre-culture. This is another interesting thing. Do we see another culture emerging? Spengler always thought that it would be the Russians. There's very good reason for this. However, you have to look at the demographics of the Russians, and you have to look at this horrible war, which is, again, tearing the heart out of what should be a birthplace of wonderful new ideas and new thinking. You know, and you could see in the art, this beautiful art of suprematism with Malevich, the abstract art of Kandinsky, and the beautiful expressionism of Chagall, and the influence that this had on the Bauhaus and on modern architecture, the influence on all of the acting that we see is Russian acting, all of it. Chekhov and Stanislavski, the way that we have acting now, you can look at someone like Laurence Olivier doing Shakespeare. That is non-Russian acting, but that we see that as old-fashioned. What we see as like Dustin Hoffman type, Julia Roberts type acting, it's Russian. There have been so many vital cultural things that have come out of there, yet it remains to be seen because for whatever reason, whenever Russian culture seems to be exiting its problems, the problems just reach up and throw it in the dirt. There might be another place. The demographics of Russia seem to be really holding back cultural development, but you know, demographics might bounce back. Who knows? But yeah, so hopefully we'll see. So seeing that we're on this shared path, where Rome went, are we going to be a continuing China-Japan style situation? Are we going to be a Rome-type civilization where it's broken off and people go out into the countryside and we all, our great-grandchildren all live like a bunch of preppers? It's possible. Or is there going to be some type of new culture? Will the Russians or perhaps South America have some type of new outgrowth? Maybe. We'll see. But again, I will look forward to discussing this, to our final analogization and our thoughts of looking into the future where we are all going, whether we want to or not. Hopefully we do. And again, thank you so much. Have a good day.